Title: The Tenant of Last Resort. Consider Dr. Vikram Patel, a healer of minds who has spent 20 years navigating the wreckage of other people's interior lives. He has learned to maintain a professional distance from the suffering he witnesses, a skill he considers clinical wisdom and his wife considers a form of cowardice. Tonight, however, the distance will collapse, for there is a technology newly minted in the laboratories of human ambition that promises to do what talk and time and medication cannot: enter the nightmare directly and dismantle it from within. What it cannot promise, what no brochure, no clinical trial, no ethics board ever thought to specify, is the direction of the door. The office existed on the 41st floor of a building that had been designed to suggest, without quite stating, that healing was a premium service: floor-to-ceiling glass. Furniture the color of calm. A white noise machine outside the consultation suite that cost more than most people's car payments, because in 2031, even silence had a price point. Vikram arrived at 7:15, 45 minutes before his first patient, because he had not slept well. He stood at the window with his coffee and watched the city assemble itself in the early light, the delivery drones threading between towers, the elevated rail casting its moving shadow across the street below, the small figures of people who had somewhere to be. He had always found the view clarifying. He found it less so this morning. The Morpheus device sat on his desk in its charging cradle, a pair of slender neural interface headbands connected by a short cable, matte black, medical grade, the size of a folded eyeglass case. It had taken 3 years of clinical trials to reach his practice. He had been among the first 50 therapists in the country licensed to use it. He kept it in the same spot every day, parallel to the edge of the desk, and every morning he experienced a brief and irrational urge to put it in a drawer. He never did, because it worked. That was the plainly inconvenient truth at the center of his ambivalence. In 14 months of use, it had helped 11 patients with treatment-resistant PTSD achieve what years of EMDR and pharmacotherapy had not: genuine resolution, not management, not coping, resolution. He had watched it happen, had been present in the shared dream space as the architecture of terror lost its structural integrity, had guided patients away from the worst rooms in their minds and toward exits they hadn't known existed. He had read the research carefully, observed the protocols scrupulously, maintained the emotional discipline the training program required. He was by any measure excellent at this. His 8th patient of the day, his only Morpheus patient currently in active treatment, was a 34-year-old woman named Claire Auden. Claire had been referred to him 11 months ago by a colleague who had exhausted her own toolkit and was honest enough to admit it. The intake notes used the word complex 4 times in 2 pages, which was clinical language for, "I'm not sure anyone can help her." Vikram had read them on a Tuesday evening at his kitchen table, while his wife watched something in the next room, and the apartment smelled like garlic and wine, and he had felt the particular pull that certain cases exerted on him. Not attraction, exactly, but recognition. The sense of a problem sufficiently difficult to be interesting. Claire Auden had survived a fire at 26. The fire had killed her younger brother. She had been the one driving. They had stopped at a gas station on Route 9 outside Danbury, Connecticut. Her brother Danny had gone inside for water and snacks. She had been scrolling her phone. She was always precise about this detail in their sessions, never softening it to checking messages or distracted, always scrolling my phone when the explosion happened. The investigation determined a fuel line fault, mechanical failure, not negligence, not her fault by any legal or physical standard. The county coroner, the insurance investigators, the NTSB report, unanimous, an accident. Claire had organized her entire nervous system around disagreeing with this conclusion. She had been in therapy, continuously, for 8 years. She had tried every medication combination her psychiatrist could justify. She functioned, held a job in urban planning, maintained an apartment in Midtown, had a small number of friends she kept at a carefully calibrated distance. But she did not sleep, not really. She passed time in a horizontal position, visited by a recurring dream that had been the same dream for 8 years, and woke each morning, having survived it, which she did not experience as survival. When Vikram first proposed the Morpheus protocol, Claire had looked at him with an expression he recognized from a handful of other patients. The expression of someone who has stopped expecting to be helped and has learned to perform the motions of hoping anyway. She'd said, "I've tried everything." He'd said, "I know, this is different." She'd asked, "How?" He'd said, "Because we go together." That had landed differently than he'd expected. He'd seen something shift in her face, not quite hope, but the ghost of the shape where hope used to live. She arrived at 8 o'clock exactly, which was always, because lateness for Claire was its own form of vulnerability, an advertisement that something had gone wrong in the morning. She wore what she almost always wore: dark slacks, a gray blouse, her dark hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had decided the body was an administrative problem to be managed. She was, Vikram had observed, in the habit of making herself smaller than she was, shoulders slightly contracted, chin slightly down, a posture that had nothing to do with her actual height and everything to do with what she believed she deserved to occupy. She set her bag by the chair, glanced at the Morpheus device on the desk, and glanced away. "How was the week?" Vikram asked. "Fine," she said, and then, "The dream was bad on Thursday. I was there longer than usual. I couldn't find the door." "The door," he repeated. Not a question, just acknowledgement. In the Morpheus work, they had mapped her dream space over 6 sessions, establishing a shared vocabulary for its geography. The fire was not the whole of it. The dream had rooms, antechambers, corridors, a series of doors that led to other doors. The fire itself was in what Claire called the last room. They had not yet reached it. Each session they got closer, and in the session immediately preceding this one, Claire had put her hand on the door handle, and Vikram had watched her fingers grip the metal, and then watched her let go. And she had woken herself up, which was a thing some patients learned to do, and had sat up on the couch with her eyes wide and her breathing locked. "You said you were ready to try the last room today," Vikram said. "I know what I said." He waited. She looked at the device. "I'm ready," she said, in the voice of someone stepping off a ledge. The protocol was standard. Vikram had performed it 47 times. He dimmed the room to 70%. He positioned the couch, white, low profile, the kind that suggested neither psychiatry's couch nor a hospital gurney, having been carefully designed to suggest nothing in particular. Claire reclined. He adjusted the headband on her temples, then his own. They had each taken their half of the shared induction compound 40 minutes prior, a mild dissociative that opened the bridge the device needed. The technology had been explained to Vikram in terms he understood well enough to use and not well enough to repair: quantum resonance, neural mapping, the device calibrating to both subjects' baseline architecture and establishing what the manufacturer called a shared phenomenological workspace. In practice, Vikram would enter Claire's dream space as an observer and co-navigator, with the capacity to interact with its elements but not to alter them unilaterally. The patient's mind remained sovereign. He could guide. He could not override. He activated the device and closed his eyes. The transition always felt like leaning through a waterfall, a moment of total sensory disruption, the world behind dissolving, and then arrival. The station. It was always the station first, before the other architectures assembled themselves. Claire's dream space had a logic that Vikram had come to know the way he knew his own apartment in the dark, by feel, by the position of things, by what to expect around which corners. The station was a train platform that did not correspond to any real train platform, with the specific hyperclarity of dreaming, the tiles too white, the light too direct, the smell of machine oil and rain, and something organic that he could never quite name. There were people on the platform who were not exactly people. They occupied peripheral vision rather than direct sight, which was characteristic of guilt architecture. the mind's way of keeping certain figures just outside full acknowledgement. Claire was already there. She stood at the edge of the platform in her dream space version, which was not quite her waking self, more elemental, the way a person in a dream is recognizably themselves, but also essentially themselves, stripped of the day's managed presentation. She looked younger here, or not younger, more exposed in the way that youth is exposed, before the defensive postures are fully constructed. "You came," she said. "Every time," Vikram said. He had learned in his training that his appearance in a patient's dream space was always inflected by the patient's relationship to him. He looked like himself, but was seen through the patient's projections, which meant different patients experienced his dream space presence differently. One former patient had told him he appeared very tall. Another had said he glowed slightly, which had unsettled him more than it probably should have. Claire had never described how he looked to her in here, and he had never asked. "The door," she said. Not a question. She began walking. He followed her through the station's familiar corridors, the tiled passage, the stairwell that smelled like smoke even here, the anteroom with the yellow wallpaper that he'd noted in his case notes as a possible displacement of remembered domestic space, possibly related to the house she'd grown up in rather than the gas station, until they reached the final corridor. It was a hallway he had been in 5 times before. Linoleum floor. Fluorescent lights with a barely perceptible flicker. At the end, a door that was fire red in the dream space rendering, which was not subtle symbolism, but rather the mind being honest about what it was protecting. Claire walked to it and stopped, stood there. He watched her breathing. Even in the shared space, even in the unreality of the dreaming, he could see her chest move. "I was on my phone," she said. Not to him. She said it to the door. "You were there," he said carefully. "You were in the car. You were present. That doesn't mean don't." The word was quiet, but it closed something. He stopped. He had learned to stop when she said don't. That was good therapy. Let the patient lead. She reached out and put her hand on the handle. Last week she had let go. He watched her grip hold. She opened the door. The smell came first. Gasoline and heat and something burnt at the molecular level. The smell of things that are not supposed to burning anyway. The room beyond was not a room. It was the scene, rendered in the brain's own specific medium, which was neither memory nor imagination, but the unholy collaboration of both. The gas station's canopy, the car, the pumps. The afternoon light of that particular Connecticut August, which Claire's mind had faithfully preserved down to the quality of the haze on the horizon. And Danny Auden was 22 years old and always would be, and he was walking out of the station's glass door with a bottle of water in each hand and a bag of pretzels under his arm, and he was grinning at something at Claire. Vikram realized at the version of Claire that existed in the memory, the one sitting in the car looking at her phone, and his face was completely undefended, completely open with the particular guilelessness of younger siblings who have not yet been taught to protect themselves around the people who love them. Vikram had worked with patients through some significant traumas. He had navigated rooms that contained things he would prefer not to have seen. He was trained for this. He stayed professional. But something happened in this room that had not happened in any previous room. He saw the notebook. It was on the car's dashboard, visible through the driver's side window, a small composition notebook, black and white marbled cover, and it was open, and on the page facing up there was handwriting. Claire's handwriting. He recognized it from the intake forms. This was not part of the mapped architecture. He had catalogued every element of Claire's dream space across their 6 previous sessions. There was no notebook. He looked at it the way you look at something in a dream when you're actually in a dream, directly with full attention, and it stayed. It didn't dissolve or shift. It was there, and it was specific. And his therapist's instinct, trained over 20 years to notice the thing in the room that the patient hasn't mentioned, sharpened. He moved toward the car. He should not have moved toward the car. His protocol was to stay with the patient, to maintain proximity, to orient them rather than explore independently. He knew this. He was moving anyway, with the specific pull of something important, and he was close enough now to read the first line of the open page. And then Claire made a sound he had never heard from her. Not a scream. Lower than a scream. A sound that came from a place in the chest where grief and guilt are the same organ. The Danny in the memory had reached the car door, and Claire, the memory Claire in the car, had looked up from her phone, and the grin on his face was changing because he could see something she couldn't see from her angle. Something behind the pumps, and he was opening his mouth to say something. The explosion happened. It happened as memory and as dream simultaneously, which meant it had the referential power of the actual event and the amplified immediacy of dream logic. And Vikram had been trained for this, had navigated it in simulation, but the notebook was in his hand. He had picked it up without realizing. He had it open in his hands, and the handwriting on the page said, "He woke up." His heart was going in his chest, and he was sitting in his chair, and the room was dim, and the white noise machine was running outside, and Claire was sitting up on the couch with her hands pressed to her face. He waited for the standard transition symptoms to resolve, the brief dissociation, the mild nausea, the 10 or 15 seconds it took for the world to reestablish its correct density. They didn't resolve. Vikram looked at his hands. They were his hands. The Morpheus headband was in his lap. He must have pulled it off upon waking, which was normal. The light in the room was the correct dimness. The charging cradle was on the desk. Claire was breathing audibly through her hands. Everything was correct, and nothing felt right. He said, "Claire?" She looked up. Her eyes were wet, and there was something in her expression he hadn't seen in 11 months of sessions. Not relief, not distress, but a strange, focused clarity, like a person who has just checked an item off a list they've been carrying for a long time. "It worked," she said. "We'll debrief in a moment," he said. "First, let's—" "You saw the notebook," she said. Vikram stopped. "On the dashboard," she said. "You saw it." The room did the thing that rooms sometimes do in the seconds after a diagnosis, the thing where all the objects in it suddenly reveal themselves as components of a system rather than random furniture, and you understand that you were the last to grasp the configuration. The charging cradle, the notebooks, the window and the city below, and the 41 floors of implied altitude between this room and the street. What was in the notebook, Claire? She folded her hands in her lap. You know what was in it. He didn't quite. He had been pulled out of the dream before he could read more than the first line. But he had read the first line. He was turning it over now, the way you turn over something you found in the road before you understand what it is. He was already at the pump when I saw the lighter in his hand. He said it aloud. He was already at the pump when I saw the lighter in his hand. Claire looked at the window. I'd been clean for 4 years, she said. Danny knew. He was the only one who knew I'd been using before that. He found my kit in the apartment. We had a fight the week before, the worst we'd ever had. He said he was going to tell our parents. She paused. I didn't plan it. I want to be clear about that. I've spent 8 years being clear about that. To myself, in my head, at 3 a.m. I saw the lighter. I saw him flick it. Just a nervous habit. He always did it. You've seen him do it in there. He didn't even register that he was next to the pump. And I thought. She stopped. Started again. There was a thought, very fast. The way thoughts come that you don't ask for. And I didn't say anything, and I didn't honk. I had my hand on the horn, and I watched him, and I didn't press it. The white noise machine ran outside the door. The city assembled and disassembled itself in the glass. 3 seconds, she said. The investigation said the fuel line ruptured and the ignition source was, they said, ambient heat. The lighter was they never knew about the lighter, and I've never known really whether the lighter was even part of it, whether what I did or didn't do made any difference. The physics, whether 3 seconds and a honked horn would have. She pressed her lips together. I've never known. Vikram sat with this. He had a patient who had spent 8 years in therapy for guilt she had been careful never to fully disclose because, to fully disclose, it would transform the story from tragedy to something else, and who had agreed to the Morpheus treatment not because she wanted to heal, but because she wanted, in some deep cellular way that she may not have been fully conscious of, to be found out, to have a witness in the room where she kept the real thing. He understood this. He had spent 20 years navigating the human mind's extraordinary talent for constructing architectures of concealment around its most unbearable rooms, and this was, if anything, a recognizable structure, not unusual, devastating, but recognizable. He was about to speak about the difference between a thought and an action, about the branch point of causation, about 8 years of unconscious self-punishment, and what it might mean to start the process of. He noticed the headband, his headband, the one that had been in his lap. It was on his head. He had not put it back on. He was certain of this the way he was certain of things in his waking life, with the solid, unremarkable certainty of the present moment. His hand went up and touched it, and it was there, and the cable that ran between the two headbands ran from his head across the couch arm to Claire's lap. And Claire was not wearing her headband. It sat on the cushion beside her, and he understood, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives all at once rather than in sequence, that the device was still running. "Claire," he said carefully, "the device is still—" "I know," she said. He started to stand. He found he couldn't. Not paralysis. Nothing so dramatic. It was more like the particular inability of a dream in which you need to run, and your legs are in a different substance than air. He was sitting in his chair, and he could move his arms and turn his head, and speak and breathe. But the vertical act of standing had become unavailable. "What did you do?" he said. It was not quite a question. Claire looked at him with the focused clarity he had misread as relief. "The device has a secondary calibration mode," she said. "In the handbook. The full handbook, not the therapist's summary. It's described as a bilateral lock function for cases where a patient's neural signature is extremely resistant. Both subjects simultaneously active, bridge-locked until manual release." She reached into the pocket of her blazer and set something on the cushion beside her. The manual release was a small physical key, the size and shape of a safe deposit key. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at him. "I read everything about it before we started. I needed to know it was possible. I needed to know I could—" She stopped. "I needed there to be a consequence." "Claire," he said, and he was careful with his voice because in 20 years he had learned that the quality of the voice in a room like this one, the emotional temperature of it, the signal it sent, was sometimes the entire intervention. "Whatever you're trying to do, this is not the 'you're in it,'" she said. "Right now, you're in me." She touched her temple. "The session didn't end when I opened my eyes. You opened your eyes and thought you woke up, but you're still connected. Your neural signature is—" She searched for the word she had read. "Resident. That's the word they use. You're resident in the architecture. You can be here and also there. It works both ways. The handbook says." He looked at his hands again. They were still his hands. The room was still the room. But he noticed, now that he was noticing, that there was something about the light, something that had been true since he opened his eyes, that he had misread as the standard post-session flatness, the slight dullness of the returned mind settling back into its space. It wasn't dullness. It was the light of the dream. The room was the room, and also it was constructed. He was here, and also he was in the notebook on the dashboard of the car in the August heat outside Danbury, Connecticut. He thought about what that meant. He thought about it with great care, the way he had been trained to think systematically, without panic. And then he stopped thinking about it systematically, because what he found at the end of the systematic thought was that the device's bilateral lock, combined with a secondary calibration mode Claire had activated, had tethered his neural signature to hers, and that the manual release was 4 feet away on a couch cushion and he could not stand up, and that Claire's neural architecture was, by clinical measure, one of the most intricate and defended and deeply inhabited spaces he had encountered in 14 months of Morpheus practice, and that the handbook word she had used, resident, was precise. "How long does the lock last?" he said. "Without the key?" She looked at the ceiling. "They don't say, exactly. The handbook says the subject's neural architecture will gradually integrate the resident signature. Like," she moved her hand in a gesture he couldn't quite read, "like scar tissue. The longer it runs, the more integrated. At some point, the distinction between the resident signature and the host architecture becomes," she stopped, "becomes what? Indistinguishable." The white noise machine outside the door ran steadily. On the 41st floor, the city went about its business. A delivery drone passed the window and was gone. Vikram thought about his wife. He thought about her specifically, the sound she made when she was reading something funny, which was not a laugh, but a small aspirated noise, almost private. He thought about the way the coffee tasted in his kitchen in the morning, which was the same coffee it had been for 11 years, but tasted like his kitchen, like his life. He thought about the specific unhappiness of not sleeping well, which he would give quite a lot to experience right now, because it was his unhappiness, with the particular texture of his own interior life. He was going to lose those. He understood this. Not all at once, the handbook apparently offered a gradual timeline, but he was going to lose the specificity of himself, the granular, particular signature of Vikram Patel, which would dissolve into the vastly more complex and populated architecture of Claire Auden's mind, and what remained would be indistinguishable from its host. He would become a room in her. He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression he could now read accurately. Not focused clarity, grief. Preemptive grief, the kind that knows exactly what it's chosen and has chosen it anyway. "You needed a witness," he said. Her jaw tightened. "You've been carrying this, the possibility, the thought, the 3 seconds, for 8 years, and everyone who's tried to help you has not been allowed in the room where it actually lives, because if you let them in, you have to show them the notebook, and the notebook makes you." He paused. "What does the notebook make you, Claire?" She pressed her lips together. "A murderer." "You don't know that. You have never known that. The physics, as you said, you will never know if the lighter ignited the fuel or if the fuel line would have ruptured regardless. I had the thought." Her voice was even. "That's what I know. I had the thought and I made a choice. Maybe the choice didn't change anything, but I made it." "Yes," he said. "You did." She looked at him. He had not said that before. Not in 11 months. He had, with the best clinical intentions, been providing her with the logical off-ramps, the accident investigation, the physical causation, the distinction between thought and action, and she had been, with the best self-protective instincts, taking none of them, because none of them addressed the thing she was actually holding. "You had a thought," he said, "that came without asking, in 3 seconds, about someone who had threatened to expose something that had almost destroyed you once and that you had worked very hard to survive. You had the thought and you didn't act on it, and then something happened that the thought had been adjacent to. And you have been unable to determine whether the proximity of the thought to the event constitutes guilt. And so you have decided it does, and you have been punishing yourself with that determination for 8 years. She was looking at him very precisely now. "The thought was real," he said. "I'm not taking it away from you. You had it. That's part of who you are, that you're capable of having it. Most people are. Most people live their entire lives without the terrible clarifying accident of finding out what their worst thought is. You found out, and you've been trying to make that finding out mean something, to make it say something definitive about what you are, because it feels like it has to mean something. Because Danny died." She was crying. He could see it in the particular stillness of her face, the refusal to let it move. "You came to me 12 sessions ago, and in 11 of them I helped you build a path toward a room. And in this last session, you finally let me into the room. And what I found is a woman who has sentenced herself to 8 years of waking death for a thought she had for 3 seconds and a decision she made that may have changed nothing, and also changed everything, and she will never know which. And she has decided that the not knowing is itself the proof. He paused. You put me in here because you needed me to know that, the real thing, and now I know it. She picked up the key. Her hand was not steady, but it moved. She reached forward. He watched her lean from the couch, the cable between them pulling taut, her fingers finding the small port on the side of the device. He felt it before the key turned, a sensation like something lifting, like a window opened in a closed room, and then the world lost its second quality, the constructed shimmer of the dreamlight fell away, and he was only in his chair, and the city was only the city, and Claire was sitting up on the couch with tears running down her face, and the key in her hand and the Morpheus device on the desk in its cradle, both headbands removed and set beside it. He looked at his hands. They were his hands in the full specific coffee and bad sleep sense of his hands. I didn't leave you a way out, she said. I'm sorry I needed. She shook her head. He thought about telling her what he had felt. The few minutes of comprehending what resident meant, the sense of himself becoming gradually porous, beginning to be absorbed so that she would understand exactly what she had been prepared to do. He decided not to. Not today. Maybe not for a long time. Instead, he said, You have an appointment Thursday. She looked at him. That's it? That's not it, he said, but it's where we start. She sat with this. Outside, a cloud crossed the sun, and the quality of light in the room changed, and she looked for a moment in that changed light like a person who had set something down that she had been carrying for 8 years, and whose arms were not yet sure what to do with the unfamiliar empty space. She nodded. She picked up her bag. She put on her coat. At the door she paused without turning around. If I had left the key, she said, if I'd walked out with the key. I know, he said. That was the original plan. I know that too. She left. The door closed with the sound of expensive hinges, engineered for discretion. Vikram sat in his chair for a long time. He didn't look at the city. He looked at the Morpheus device on his desk, its clean lines, its clinical promise, the cable coiled neatly between the two headbands, and he felt something he couldn't immediately name, and then named it gratitude. Not for his escape from the architecture. For the brief minutes inside it, when he had been close enough to the thing she'd actually been carrying to see it clearly, and had found the right words for what he saw, which was, in the end, what he had been trained for. What the device had allowed him to do. What the device had very nearly prevented him from doing. He put it in the drawer. He sat at his desk and opened his notes and wrote the date and the session number, and then sat with his pen above the paper for a long time before he wrote a single word, which was, Witness, we leave Dr. Vikram Patel in his 41st floor office, having narrowly avoided becoming a permanent installation in someone else's interior life, which is, of course, the occupational hazard of the healing arts. Rendered here in slightly more literal terms, the question the good doctor will carry home tonight, past the city and the dinner, and the wife who calls his distance a form of cowardice, is not whether Claire Auden intended to keep him. It is whether, for those few minutes of comprehending what it meant to be dissolved into another person's guilt, he understood her finally, completely, in a way that no clinical method had previously permitted. Some doors, it turns out, only open from the inside. Some witnesses can only testify by entering the room. And in the territories of the haunting area, the difference between being a healer and being healed is, sometimes, a single key.